think I'm good to go. Good afternoon. How are y'all? Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon. We're going to have a great talk, Middle-Aged Caregivers and Their Aging Parents by Dr. Robert Strom and Dr. Paris Strom. So we're really looking forward to the presentation. I hope you all are enjoying week 2 of classes at our different locations and our course offerings. We are also getting geared up for winter term. So if you have suggestions or if you know of someone who would like to teach for Ollie next term, please contact myself or Barbara. Don't forget about our holiday social, which will be December 6th at Holy Trinity. Does anyone have any announcements they would like to share with the group regarding community activities? All right, if not, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Robert Strom is a professor with lifespan development psychology at Arizona State University. His research and writing center on the strengths and learning needs of parents and grandparents. He is a Fulbright scholar in Sweden, the Philippines, and Australia. His career began as a teacher in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Detroit, Michigan. Dr. Paris Strom is a professor of educational psychology at Auburn University in the College of Education. He teaches online courses in child, adolescent, and lifespan learning. His research and publications focus on building family relationships, improving student teamwork skills, and evaluating conditions of learning in schools. He began his career as a high school teacher in Phoenix, Arizona. Would you all please join me in welcoming Dr. Strom?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for attending today. We appreciate your interest in this very important topic. First off, before I forget, we are co-teaching, my father and I, a class on grandparenting for Ollie. Our second session is tomorrow morning. First things, there is a handout on the chair near the door in case you didn't get it. The second thing is we always prefer to have questions asked at the end of our presentation. I will be presenting first, and then we'll hand over my mic to my colleague over here, so that'll just be a 45-second transition. I have a special microphone on. And also we have a website at the bottom of the handout that's very important called grandparentslearn.org, which explains a lot of our many years of efforts in research and programming, specifically in the area of learning to become better grandparents. He has been a pioneer in this field, and I am simply lucky enough to be part of the journey with him. Okay, let me begin the presentation here with a joke for you, just to liven it up, huh? Okay, Adam was walking around. First off, can you hear me all right? Good. Adam was walking around the Garden of Eden feeling very lonely. So God asked him, "What is wrong with you?" Adam said he didn't have anyone to talk to face-to-face, or on Skype, or FaceTime, or on the cell phone. God decided that he was going to give Adam a companion, and it would be a woman. He said, "This person will cook for you and wash your clothes. She will always agree with every decision that you make. She will bear your children and never ask you to get up in the middle of the night to take care of them. She will not nag you and always be the first to admit she is wrong when you have a disagreement. She will never have a headache and freely give you love and companionship as needed." Adam asked God, "What will a woman like this cost?" God said, "An arm and a leg." Here it comes. Adam replied, "What can I get for just a rib?" Ba-dum-bum. So the rest is history. Sometimes we have unreasonable expectations for relatives. That's what the joke is about having unreasonable expectations. So sometimes we do have unreasonable expectations for relatives that prevent close relationships and undermine mental health. This is often the case for middle-aged caregivers and their aging parents. We ask graduate students in a course on lifespan learning to look ahead, imagine the next stage of their life, and describe major challenges they anticipate during middle age. a time when they would be 40 to 60 years old. Most identified potential concerns about being able to provide guidance for daughters and sons in a fast-changing environment, having enough funds to pay for rising tuition of higher education, and being able to set aside money to last for a lengthy retirement. Few students talked about the likelihood about having to be a caregiver for aging parents. Nevertheless, this is the prospect facing more women and men than ever before. Let me get a drink of water first. Hang on, sorry. My mouth gets all mealy-mouthed when I speak. Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Consider the scope of caregiving. We could wish happy birthday to 10,000 people born in 1953 who become 65 years old today. The same birthday wishes are appropriate tomorrow and each day after until the year 2030. Stated another way, the population of retirees will double in little over a decade. Okay? That's according to the US Census Bureau 2018. As lawmakers try to shape policies for the health care of 72 million baby boomers, the scope of responsibility for middle-aged caregivers is beginning to emerge. Having a longer life means almost everyone will eventually need help. Caregiving for aging parents is now met by 42 million members of what is called the sandwich generation, named because of their place between two age groups that usually depend upon them. The sandwich generation are people in their 30s or 40s responsible for bringing up children and providing care for their aging parents. In terms of present and future living arrangements, most older adults live in their own home, typically less than a 2-hour drive from at least one relative. The majority, 68%, live with a spouse or other relatives. The remainder live alone in non-family settings such as assisted care or share living quarters with a friend. The Harvard University Joint Center for Housing Studies predicts a more promising future. By 2035, nursing homes that currently account for around 5% of older adults will decline as a growing proportion of real estate developers cater to the older market, building homes that fit their needs better than they do now. More aging homeowners will have disabilities that require things such as zero-step entrances, single-floor homes, wide hallways, doorways that allow for wheelchairs, lever-style handles, robotic help of various kinds, and electronic controls. These future norms for living represent only 1% of current available housing. In terms of cost of caregiving, you'll find this interesting. Wherever they live, middle-aged adults and aging parents usually offer mutual support. The American Association of Retired Persons indicates 78% of middle-aged adults, on average, spend $7,000 a year on out-of-pocket expenses involving elder care. The personal contributions of family caregivers is estimated to be $470 billion with a B, dollars a year. That is the cost that society would have to pay if families did not respond to older relatives. As the baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, enter high-risk health years, their smaller population of children, known as the Generation X, born between 1964 and 1984, will result in a lower caregiver support ratio. So this means the number of potential caregivers for each person who is 80 or older is now 7 caregivers, but will shrink to 4 caregivers in the next decade. So we've got some concerns there. Most elders want to live independently and stay home as long as possible. That's very reasonable. In support of this goal, the U.S. Congress earlier this year passed the RAISE Family Caregivers Act. RAISE stands for Recognize, Assist, Support, and Engage Family Caregivers. The new law obligates the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services to develop, maintain, and regularly revise a strategy to recognize and support family caregivers. A broad range of people in the private and public sectors will form a national advisory council to recommend actions. Advisory council meetings will be open for public input and must begin by late 2019. The emphasis of this council will be on gathering data about evidence-based promising practices and innovative family caregiving methods, along with better coordination and eliminating duplication of federal, state, and community services. Everyone should realize that caregiving involves additional vulnerable groups other than just the elderly. There are, for example, 4 million caregivers who support a child under the age of 18 with a medical, behavioral, or other disability. Another 4 million with mental or developmental disabilities live with family caregivers. And 1 million caregivers are themselves age 60 or older. The goals for this presentation today are to describe family communication on aging parent needs, reflect on concerns of caregivers regarding how they will manage what is expected of them, identify the common needs of aging parents, recognize limitations and needs of caregivers, anticipate potential conflicts, and identify family, employer, and community efforts to help family caregivers. Now, with that in mind, let me transfer my microphone system to my colleague. And I wonder if I need that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's all right. It's all right. Yeah, come on.
Me? Okay. Well, we're starting on your outline on communication about needs of parents. Most middle-aged people admit they feel uncertain about how they're going to manage the reversal of roles that happens when their parents become old. And making personal needs known is necessary for harmony between the two groups. Both of them should be aware of what older relatives require, and they should agree on what are reasonable expectations for the caregivers. Each person should state their opinions about the needs of the aging parents. Initially, help will be needed, of course, with housekeeping, with yard care. And when it's affordable, elders should hire someone from outside the family to do that, rather than expect their caregivers to do it. Now, this is a hard thing for some people because older people have saved money, but they're reluctant to change no longer reasonable spending habits. And persuasion may be needed to help them understand that this assistance from outside the family is a good idea. Later, when the parents have to give up driving, their needs expand to include transportation to the store, visiting doctors, getting their hair fixed, attending church. They may also want more contact with their grandchildren. And unless these needs are expressed, they may not be met. Middle-aged caregivers cannot anticipate all of the needs of parents without being told. And many families, I think, rely upon intuition when a more sensible approach is clarity of communication. Aging parents have needs they may not recognize, but are detected by their middle-aged caregivers. For example, conversations should focus mostly on current issues, so everyone feels an obligation to keep up and to share ideas about what's happening in the family, in the community, in the nation, and the world. Focusing on the present is a way to discourage excessive reminiscence, a big problem among older people, dwelling on the past. And in this context, daughters and sons may discover that parents become isolated because they refuse to take advantage of socialization opportunities in the community. When that realization occurs, it should be brought to the attention of the parents. Daughters and sons must be willing to express their opinions about all of a parent's needs, including their continued involvement with learning, with volunteering in the community, and adjusting to family changes. Aging parents who pursue those goals are less egocentric, less self-centered, and more concerned about the well-being of other people. Now, there's benefit in anticipating ahead of time areas of disagreement that are likely to arise. More families, for example, must be willing to talk about the concepts that matter the most to them. A common explanation is neither party wants to worry the other or upset them, so they don't talk about things. Instead, aging parents should be expected, for example, to assume responsibility for completing a will. You won't live forever. And power of attorney, burial preferences, medical directives about life support. Because tragedy can happen suddenly, it's never too soon to talk about death. We convened a group of caregivers, middle-aged caregivers, to discuss conflict with their aging parents. What do you argue about? Here are some of their selections. The need to reconcile independence and interdependence. Laura says, my dad is 84. He wants to do everything around the house, but he no longer is able to safely manage some of the things. I worry that if he gets on a ladder or tries to do heavy lifting, it could be dangerous. And when I tell my willingness to him to find someone else to do it, he gets mad and says, no thanks. People should talk about how family expectations are changing. When older people grew up, independence was the basis for judging personal success. And depending too much on other people was seen as evidence of failure, and we called those people a burden. Now, in contrast, kids who are growing up today are expected to develop not only independence, but the skills of interdependence, or you can't solve problems in the community place, in the workplace, because you have to have collective intelligence. So all age groups have to transition from the idea that you need to be both independent and interdependent, or you won't work well with people in the workplace. It's interesting to note that one of the criticisms of employers is that oftentimes people come to work for the first time and they don't have any experience in being able to collaborate with one another. There's also benefit, I think, in recognizing the independence concern from the view of aging parents. They like to believe that younger relatives come to visit them because they want to see me instead of to check up on me. And do they examine the contents of my refrigerator to find out whether any items are past the use-by date? Does my house pass their cleanliness test? And some elders feel continually assessed, overprotected, and wonder whether they're still in control. Another concern they mentioned was the need to expand the scope of social interaction. Gladys said, my dad died 2 years ago. Mavis, my mother, now lives alone several miles from my husband and I and our 2 children. And each day I phone to check, I check in, I discover what's happening with her, see if she needs anything. Mom likes to see me, she likes to come over, have meals and visit, but she doesn't want to socialize outside the family. And when I suggest to her going to the senior center, she explains that being around old people doesn't appeal to her. Gladys should visit the senior center to identify activities that may really appeal to her mom. She should also tell Mavis that students today are learning communication skills that were not taught in the past, and they need now in order to communicate with other generations. Those skills can be taught at senior centers with facilitators, and they help people learn how to respect divergent opinion, limit speaker time, avoid interruption, wait for answers, challenge statements, encourage clarification, and retain optimism. And those assets help discussions when you talk to younger people in your family. The need to retain a sense of purpose and meaning. Jenny's a single mother, and she has a busy and difficult schedule. She's disappointed when her phone calls and visits with Harold, her recently retired father, not in this audience, centers on complaints about his lack of satisfaction with retirement. Having employment is a source of self-esteem for young and middle-aged adults. The chance to spend time in ways that you prefer during retirement supposedly will replace the job as the key to having favorable self-impression. Nevertheless, some older adults report retirement is accompanied by a lack of purpose and meaning. and they have to have that restored. A community service, very often they find, is a worthwhile way to do that, and they understand that their obligations toward other people is the one way to demonstrate maturity. Everyone's better off when retirees volunteer and share their talents with the society. I had the privilege for 5 years in Phoenix, Arizona, to be chair of the board for RSVP, the Retired Senior Volunteers Program. Each day we had 1,000 volunteers who would volunteer in schools, community agencies, and so forth. It's important, I think, to recognize that 90% of the people who volunteer in schools are retired people. That's 7 million of them. Now, it's also true that sometimes the recognition of exploring what it would be like to be in a assisted living or long-term care center is something that should be understood, and the opportunity should be provided for older people. In many cases, if someone said, I want to be able to determine what goes on in a long-term care facility, you can find out by taking a tour. And they will answer the questions. They'll talk about how much it costs. They'll talk about the problems that exist there and how they try to overcome them. Another issue has to do with their use of computers. In many cases, they choose not to. But in Miles's case, he said, I want to buy my family a computer because my children, all of them have iPhones, and yet we can't communicate with Grandma except at certain occasions when everybody's on the phone and we briefly greet them. And when he offered to get them a computer, they indicated that, well, we don't know how to use one, so we wouldn't be able to benefit from it. Again, he could take her to the senior center, and they could get on iChat, or they could have Skype, or they could communicate, and then would understand the benefit of accepting his offer. There's a need to continue conversations about the best interests of an older relative. Aging parents do not want to go to any kind of a facility, usually. But when their behavior poses a danger to them and others based on, for example, forgetting to turn the stove off, failing to take medications, not eating properly, then relying on personal choice may not be the best option. Looking ahead, it's very clear, and Paris mentioned early on, the Harvard studies for the future of housing are really dramatic. Sometime you may want to look at them. But they're based also on what's happening in Europe. In Sonera, for example, it's a Netherlands tech company. They install 8 sensors in the home of older people who are living alone, and that electronic tool allows his children in their 50s to monitor when he gets out of bed, when he goes to the bathroom, when he eats meals, when he goes outside the house, by using an app that pings whenever something is wrong. He's aware of being watched, but he also feels safer, and his children have peace of mind. Related technologies now underway call for a small smart stove that turns itself off if there's a hazard, a pill dispenser that tells when it's time for medication and delivers it, and smart pipes which can turn off the water when it's necessary. Those kinds of electronic products are going to become much less expensive and more available over time. Some of you, for example, have the Amazon's Echo, and this is a voice-controlled digital assistant allowing Alexa to answer common questions, set a timer for activities like getting exercise by walking around the house, reading the news to you, phoning relatives, going to appointments, connecting to other devices that control the lights, thermostat, and television. Those kinds of innovations are going to improve quality of life dramatically and allow people who otherwise would have to leave home to stay home. It's also a good request for you to make for Christmas if they say, what would you like? You would like an Amazon Echo. Now, we have to recognize the needs of the caregivers. The average caregiver is a 46-year-old woman who is employed and devotes about 20 hours a week to helping elderly parents. Provisions of care for aging relatives have to be shared in a broader way than is happening right now. Middle-aged caregivers have to decide what they can reasonably expect of themselves and still be able to do things that are otherwise expected of them. There are, for example, all of these women, or most of these women, also have a husband to take care of. They've got a house to take care of. They have children to take care of. They have a lot of things they have to do, and the emotional toll on them is stress, sadness, worry, and loss of sleep. If you're familiar with the Gallup Share Well-Being Index, this is a summary of surveys of 1 million people every year that annually tracks the health conditions of our society. And this index has consistently, over the last few years, ranked middle-aged women as having the worst state of mental health and the highest rate of depression in our society. This is the case whether the women are employed at work or whether they work at home. The American Psychological Association does an annual Stress in America survey of 1,200 people, and they have found that over half of middle-aged caregivers feel overwhelmed by the scale of the tasks expected of them. So given all of these many responsibilities of caregivers, it's not surprising that they have to have some kind of way of getting relief. And annual caregiver groups report being discouraged often because their parents are never satisfied, no matter what you do to make their life more comfortable. I think older adults should remind one another that your adult children deserve gratitude for caregiving. People who are ungrateful make the task of helping them more difficult. Research studies have found that caregivers are 3 times more likely than their aging parents to be depressed, 4 times more likely to feel anger. And when that kind of stress continues over a long period, the consequences can undermine a marriage, they can jeopardize relationships with children, and they can lead to mistreatment of older people. Now, some of the common tasks of the middle-aged caregivers are providing companionship and emotional support, helping with household chores, handling bills, dealing with insurance claims, giving personal care like bathing, dressing, managing multiple medications, including injections, identifying and arranging for coordinated services, hiring and supervising care workers in the home, transporting elders to medical appointments, communicating with healthcare professionals, advocating and interpreting at medical appointments, coordination for transition for hospitals to the home, and I think sharing ideas using books. A good example for me has been my wife and her mother. They decided they would each buy a book, the same book. They happened to like books similarly, and they would then decide we'll read 1 chapter a week and then we'll discuss it. And this was a rich way in which they could monitor the thinking and the feelings of one another. And we should be using books much more in that way. They happen to like Barbara Taylor Bradford books. Then there needs to be a shared responsibility. We can't keep saying that women who are middle-aged mostly, there are of course men too, but women who are middle-aged mostly are taking the major caregiver obligation, but we have to become sensible about siblings. The need for caregivers to get periodic relief is very important, and very often brothers and sisters who live in another town or another state will take the view, well, thank God I don't live there. You need to participate in the care of your aging parents, and that means that you would share some of the expenses, the financial expenses. You would also come and visit so that the main caregiver gets time off for a vacation. Or if you can't do that, then you would fly the grandparents to where you are and do that. This is a major issue in terms of the relationship among siblings too, because it can create a life remainder time resentment of the others in my family who somehow suppose that their role is to be a cheerleader. I'm supposed to do it all. That's a big mistake. We also need to realize that there are other people who should be involved. Grandchildren can be a unique source of emotional caregiving. About 83% of older people, that is over 65, are grandparents. Middle-aged parents should teach their children, you have a responsibility to keep in touch with your grandparents. Fulfilling that obligation is needed for a couple reasons. First, it's needed for the emotional development of the children. They need to grow up. And it also confirms for older adults that people in their family actually care about them. Margaret said it this way, "It seems ironic to me that because of television, I know what happens around the world every day, yet I'm poorly informed about what goes on in the life of my grandchildren." Preschoolers are not motivated, as they will be in a few years, to constantly network with their friends, and they don't depend on peers for identity. They also lack competence to read and send text messages. So those restrictive conditions make early childhood a wonderful time to foster the beginning of emotional development. One way to initiate the practice is for young children to dictate messages that parents send by email. Older relatives want to learn directly from grandchildren about what they're doing, the things they enjoy, the failures they have, the worrisome situations they face. And in response, older relatives can share their feelings and ideas by email or text that are messages that are read by the parent to the child. The old and the young can also spend time then, of course, talking on Skype or FaceTime. The responsibility to stay connected to grandparents is necessary so older adults can be looked upon as available and relevant sources of guidance. Elaine describes a related obstacle in her relationship with her grandchildren. She says, "I don't like it when my middle-aged daughter assumes the role of a reporter about the experiences of all my school-aged grandchildren. She tells me the good things that are happening, the school achievements, the victories on the sports teams, other things my grandchildren are doing. I know it's a partial picture and not the whole picture. There's never any news about disappointing events, even though I'm sure my grandchildren must have such experiences. Fears and failures are never told to me because the parents suppose I need to avoid worrying and I need to believe they're good parents. I think it's important for me to be accurately informed so I can encourage my grandchildren when they face hard times. This when I'm really needed the most, but I can't respond if I'm poorly informed. I can't be a listener or a source of comfort when the news is always told to me, everything is fine, Grandma, everything's fine. And my grandchildren may wonder sometimes why I never console them when they need emotional encouragement and support. Now, partial or biased reporting by parents prevents grandparents from having any knowledge that they need, and it denies an opportunity to encourage resilience to deal with predictable setbacks. Parents report that exclude grandchild problems cause some grandparents to suppose growing up must really be easy. My grandchildren never have any problems. Well, grandchildren and grandparents should challenge, I think, why the relatives don't take them into their confidence. You do that even with casual friends. And I think because of that, there needs to be a recognition that grandparents can tell the family, I'd like to hear directly from my grandchildren, not through my daughter or my son-in-law. I like to ask grandchildren, for example, questions like this. Who do you think should take care of people when they become old and they need help? What kinds of help have you observed your older relatives need? What needs do your grandparents have that could be better met by your family? What things have you observed your grandparents do to help other people? Who is the one person who helps your grandparents more than anyone else? What could public schools do to meet social needs of people in long-term care or assisted living? How do you suppose caregiving is going to change many years from now when you're old? What do you know about the nation's Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid programs? Those conversations don't happen at all. They're relevant. It's also important for us to be aware that some of the help these main caregivers give should be from employer and community support. It's a false assumption that in previous generations, families more often cared for aging parents. In previous generations, most people never became aged. A more accurate observation is that families now provide 75% of the care for older people whose population is larger than ever before because people are living longer. IBM was the first company to provide employers with daycare for aging parents. Fannie Mae, which has 6,000 employees in the Washington, D.C. area, was a pioneer in arranging flexible work hours for caregivers, having emergency backup for adult care, $45 a day. Social workers who make referrals for adult care, lunchtime seminars, crisis counseling, help with legal, financial, and emotional counseling. The outcomes of those initiatives are better care for older people, less anxious caregivers, and more productivity in the workplace. During the past 2 years, other well-known companies have come on board to show concern about elder care. Microsoft and Facebook operate now a 4 to 6 week paid leave policy for caregivers of their aging parents. Discovery Communications and Deloitte offer a 12-week parent leave program to cover the caregiving costs if relatives are sick. A national study by the Families and Work Institute found that 75% of employers are now beginning to provide paid leave or unpaid time off so employers can provide elder care without jeopardizing their job. We're still at the place where those benefits are occurring mostly by large employers, 65% of them, much less by small employers. But clearly, there is a national need to reform the workplace culture so that more caregivers of aging parents can perform effectively as family members and employees. The nonprofit Transamerica Institute in Baltimore surveyed 3,000 caregivers across the country, and most of them were employed full-time. An aspect of their disappointing report was that 40% of them felt they have an inflexible schedule at work, forcing them to reduce the number of hours or to quit the job. Mandy's an example of that. When her dad needed care and her mom was not up to the task, she requested time off. She had saved leave time and priority tasks at work were not as high as usual. She was surprised when the supervisor, in her late 20s, said, "If your dad isn't dying, just continue doing your work." Most of Mandy's co-workers were in their late 20s and seemed clueless about what's involved with managing the care of an aging parent. Before long, she quit her job. Nancy's situation is similar. She cared for her mother who had mild dementia, and because adult daycare programs in her community closed at 5 o'clock each night, she had to leave work early to arrive at the center before it closed. Results of the Transamerica survey indicate that 55% of caregivers reported their responsibilities leave them physically and emotionally exhausted. More people in society must care about these people. In many ways, the care of aging parents is more difficult than arranging care for children. After-school programs now have greatly reduced the concerns of parents about the welfare of their children because they can stay at school and do things that are fun until it's time for the parents to come home from work. There's a sense of predictability about the need for childcare that has enabled planning, whereas caring for aging parents presents unanticipated obstacles that have to require attention. Employers should provide separate education programs for middle-aged caregivers and aging parents to support the adjustment of both groups. More caregivers should recognize that their obligations go beyond getting groceries, doing household chores, transportation. When these demanding tasks are the only focus, insufficient attention is given to maintaining satisfying relationships. So when elders move to a long-term care facility, Some caregivers may feel relief that their responsibilities are completed and staff at the facility can now take over the caregiving. In effect, the caregivers conclude, I've done my share. Now she's in a long-term care center, it's up to someone else. In the issue that you have on the website on your outline, you'll see that if you go to that site, one of the groups we worked with was a site where there were 800 people in a long-term care facility. And we established education programs for them that were indigenous-led. But almost 60% of them, and you'll find that true of other places as well, people in long-term care will tell you that visits by family are infrequent. That's a form of neglect. And it imposes loneliness, and it undermines the feeling that my life matters at all. Now, there are two sides to the equation. When grandparents are between 50 and 75, and I remind you again that most people, not all, but most people become grandparents between 48 and 51. So they're going to have 30 years as a grandparent, and they could do something. But between 50 and 75, some grandparents devote almost all their time to personal interests. And during that time, they seldom help younger relatives, often excusing themselves with the claim that, I don't want to interfere with your parenting. Later, when they become frail, those who've been selfish with their time, haven't spent energy on their family, then they expect other people to take care of them. And that suggests the need to link aging parent care with grandparent education, because studies of relationship between aging parents and adult children rarely make any mention about the obligations of older people in the equation. When older adults are encouraged to pitch in while they're still young, and I know some of the people we have in our classes here actually take care of younger grandchildren. That saves the family money. It creates relief for the parent. It does a lot for the relationship that that child will never forget. And when older adults then pitch in while they're still young and healthy and independent, then the adjustment of everybody to their less viable status is easier and less often a source of resentment by younger people. Besides caregiving then and expense sharing with siblings and grandchildren, it's also a benefit in knowing about community services that lighten the load. For every adult who is in long-term care, 2 others stay home where they get all kinds of possible benefits if they're aware of them. Meals on Wheels, for example, allows for a nutritious meal every day. It has a social purpose as well, so that when the person delivers the meal, they interact with them for a time. There are services like housekeeping assistance, reassurance, phone calls, friendly visitors, adult daycare, dial-a-ride transportation, social activities at senior centers, a lot of things. 30 years ago, Mary Middleman, who's a professor of psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine, began a program that was for caregivers of relatives suffering from dementia. And that model program has been underwritten for 20 years by the National Institute of Health. It begins with 2 individual counseling sessions, allowing caregivers to identify their own special needs that they experience in carrying out their role, like bathing or administering shots. Then there are 4 family counseling sessions participating in support groups, including the siblings who may live somewhere else. And then there are additional counseling as needed by phone. Now, that research compared caregivers who received counseling with those who didn't. And the findings have shown that the caregivers who received the counseling were less depressed, demonstrated more healthy behaviors. In addition, social support from other family members increased, and it made it possible for a spouse or a partner to keep the person with dementia home for an additional 18 to 24 months. The approach has been significant, now has been adopted in 11 states. In the state of Minnesota, they expect it will save them over $1 billion over a few-year period. And a study then involving Great Britain, Australia, and U.S. confirmed benefits among the three cultures as well. Mary operates an online training program for social workers, nurses, psychologists, and others wanting to initiate their own program in their own community. If you have an interest in something like that, you can look at family.support at nyumc.org, or you can just go on Google and look up Mary Mittelman, Mittelman. It's a wonderful program. Before concluding, I want to remind us how fortunate we are to live in a nation that has Social Security, pensions, health care, family caregivers. In many nations, retirement is uncommon. Getting a pension is not a norm, and children are not available to provide care. To illustrate, a Social Security system is lacking in rural China with a population of more than 700 million people. Those elders have to rely on filial piety, it's called. It's a Confucian tradition of depending on the oldest son to continue the family name, inherit property, provide care and financial assistance during old age. Because daughters become part of their husband's family, girls have been valued less in China. During the one-child policy there, enacted to prevent widespread starvation from 1979 to 2016, females, when identified by ultrasound, were often aborted. In 2013, China passed a law requiring people who have moved to the cities for jobs to respond to the psychological needs of their rural parents so they don't feel neglected. Younger relatives are expected to visit aging parents, often to send greetings. On our website, you'll also find studies we've done both in China and Japan, in Sweden, and Australia. The one-child policy in China lasted for 38 years, and it left, as we now see, rural areas millions of girls short for men to marry. And when aging parents get care, it is from the wife of their son, that is to say, their daughter-in-law, whose relationship to her husband is considered less important than his relationship to his parents. The Confucian tradition is to raise daughters to follow three obediences: to depend on her father and older brother in youth, her husband at marriage, and her son after the death of her husband. Girls are raised to work in the home, first to serve parents, and later the same duties for in-laws. So negative impressions and jokes about mother-in-laws really originated and are still maintained in China and Japan. Maintaining a satisfying relationship with aging parents is a priority for most middle-aged people. Achieving this goal depends on having mutual knowledge about each other. Conversations are important as identified by each party. More people have to become involved in supporting these middle-aged caregivers, siblings, grandchildren, the community, all of us. And all elders who are cared for should express gratitude so caregivers get the favorable feedback they deserve. Caring for aging parents should become recognized as an achievement by the family, the community, and the society. And everyone should consider, I think, the observation of Rosalind Carter, the 91-year-old First Lady. She told us that there are only 4 kinds of people in the world: those who've been caregivers, those who are caregivers now, those who will become caregivers, and those who will need caregiving. Now, in review, briefly, these are the 10 things we've tried to say to you. Family conversations focused on identifying needs of aging parents is an effective way to improve well-being. In addition to each person stating their own opinions, both generations should agree on what is reasonable for the expectation of the middle-aged caregiver. Number 2, caring for aging parents is a developmental task that must be met by a larger proportion of people than in the past because of the longer lifespan. And that task requires greater maturity than is common in a culture that promotes self-centeredness. The qualities of successful caregivers require a concern for others, minimal egocentrism, lots of patience, compassion, and optimism. Not particularly prominent in our time. Number 3, middle-aged women carry a disproportionate share of the responsibility for elder care, and the combined responsibilities of them is to help younger and older relatives and obligations and employers that we should all be recognized by being able to pitch in and participate in the care. That includes siblings, it includes grandchildren, and others. Number 4, families should discuss matters of importance. Discussions about health and death ought to be welcome. You're not going to live forever. Introduce legal concerns like estate planning, completing a will or trust. When some younger people don't know what your money is, where it is, what you're going to do with it, you can hardly talk about trusting them. It's also important for them to know, what are your burial preferences? What about medical directives? These are conversations that don't happen, but they're fundamental, and they make it more difficult for people when you pass on. Number 5, older adults benefit when they're exposed to peer norms of socialization and fitness. And the influence of peers should include exercise. Get involved with Harold on that one. He's here today. Learning, social interaction, reliance on friends as listeners, helping to monitor the quality of your thinking, volunteering in the community, and encouraging assistance for caregivers. Number 6, caregivers need education to acquaint them with community resources. We have wonderful resources in the Auburn-Opelika area that many older people know nothing about. You need to find out about it. Churches and civic groups need to change some of their patterns. If you look at most churches, they're totally age segregated for Sunday school and everything else. There needs to be a blending of the middle age and the older people together, but we're stuck with a model that really is old-fashioned and dysfunctional. We also need to have classes for adults so that they can recognize issues of elder mistreatment. We've got lots of problems with mistreatment of elders in our society. And even though about 2 million cases are reported every year, that's only the tip of the iceberg. Most people are abused in their own home, not in a long-term care center, since there are less people there. And they're often abused mostly by their caregivers. And that's because they're under such stress. They have so much to cope with that sometimes they don't behave in ways they would want to know. We need to be much more concerned about that. We also need to be aware that if you have elders who are in long-term care, you need to visit them as often as you can, not only because it will help them know you care about them, but I can tell you that if you visit long-term care, it'll change the behavior of the people who are caring for your mother. They will be on guard and know that you might walk in anytime. People who don't have any visitors, lots of problems for them that you can help avoid. Number 7, recognize that conversation with aging relatives should avoid excessive reminiscence. It's one of the best reasons for talking to younger people, because they don't have your background. They don't want to talk about your past. They want to talk about now and the future, and that's what we should be talking about. Lack of visitation, number 8, to relatives in long-term care is a form of neglect, because it imposes loneliness, and it says to them, you're not really important at all. Institutional staff can provide physical care, and we've got good caregivers in many long-term care centers, but they cannot become your parent, your child. That is a relationship in the family that you have to take responsibility for. Number 9, families should recognize that the majority of elder care abuse involves self-neglect. Takes place in the home, usually older women, They don't make meals because there's nobody else to cook for. They don't take care of themselves. They don't change clothes. They often don't really have the kind of habits that are in their best interest. And when that's discovered, something needs to be done by the family, and it may be another situation. Number 10, the willingness of elders to explore what life is like in assisted living facilities should be encouraged. We have a number of them that are really good ones here. Many people who are older have never visited any of them. They don't have a clue what they're like, what the benefits are, what they cost. And this opportunity can help aging parents demystify the institutional experience. If parents living at home forget to take medications, don't cook nutritious meals, leave the stove on, ignore running water, it's time then to consider a different way to preserve safety and quality of life.